All right, welcome back everyone to Kopitiam Council. This is the second part of our interview with Mr. Avtar Singh, a local historian that focuses on Sabahan history, Borneo history, and other kinds of historical topics, which are very fascinating indeed. And I think we're just going to continue on here because since we're a Sabahan-based podcast, we are going to just focus more on the history of Sabah. I think in particular, the history that we all are a bit familiar with, but just don't really understand the nuances here. So, on Sabah history, after because you mentioned there were a lot of other forces that were influencing the merger of the federation, right? The Federation of Malaysia here. What do you feel, aside from the communist paranoia that Tunku had? What other elements were at play when seems to be, how do you say, explain how that kind of fell through the cracks here, things that weren't really mentioned in the mainstream historical narrative? Do you feel like there's anything not really emphasized but just as important?
In the beginning, the Philippines actually discusses the issue of Sabah privately through diplomatic channels. And the Philippine foreign minister, who is also a lawyer, goes through the agreements, the various agreements signed over North Borneo with the Europeans. And in the private documents that we've seen, he is in support of the British and saying that there's no case, there's actually nothing really to claim. But there are individuals within what is the old Sulu Sultanate that are lobbying for help from various governments and nations as well. And they make it into sort of a personal, not a war's not the word, a personal agenda. It becomes a political issue when it comes out in the newspapers. And people are asking, hey, why isn't the Philippine government trying to get back land that was stolen from us? Because in their mind, the Sulu Sultanate is part of the Philippines. So that's Philippine territory. Why are we not trying to get it back? And it kicks off from there. And the British are so angry because they had already warned Tunku Abdul Rahman, who had been negotiating at that period of time. We warned you about this. We told you to speak to the Philippine government to put an end to this so that it doesn't carry on, and you didn't listen to us. So then they have to worry about this hassle. And they're like, look, if this becomes a long-drawn matter, we may not be able to do the merger. We may not be able to get rid of North Borneo. And that was really the intention. They wanted to get rid of North Borneo and Sarawak because they'd become a financial economic burden to the government, the Foreign Office. The other headache that they had was not also communism, but the fact is the rise of Sukarno as well. By the early 1960s, the most advanced air force in Southeast Asia was non-European, non-colonial air force. The most advanced was Indonesia. Indonesia had acquired modern fighters and modern bombers from the Soviet Union. And they had a modern air force. And it's something that Malaya didn't have. So we were dependent on the British. And the British didn't want to get into an air war, or they didn't want things to escalate. And so the Australians start negotiating with Indonesia. And some of the promises made include, look, if you're going to go and take Papau, we're willing to turn a blind eye to it, to what you're going to do, provided you don't stop or interfere with the merger. This hasn't happened. The Indonesians make a lot of noise. They're very unhappy about it. So if you look at it in the greater scheme of things, the British had multiple headaches. They had just finished the war in the jungle, which they barely won. Communism was on the rise in Singapore within the workers. Okay, I'm not talking about an army in Singapore. We're talking about ordinary workers being influenced by communist leaders who are giving them ideas that you should be paid more for your work and so forth. And these are the pressures that the British have on deciding what to do with North Borneo and Sarawak. So it's a lot more complicated than just one thing. It's several things going on at that period of time. And the most shocking thing is that Donald Stevens had been against the merger to form Malaysia with Singapore and Malaya. He'd been an advocate for independence for North Borneo. He goes to a government meeting in Singapore in late 1961. comes back from that meeting and he announces at the airport in Jesselton that we are all for the merger. And this is sort of late August 1961, early September 1961. And it catches everybody by surprise because everybody along that line had already believed that we're not going to, we're against it. And suddenly he had changed his mind. And so there's a story to that as well. So
in the part two of your why North Borneo would never achieve independence, you mentioned about the Borneo bloc proposal. And one of the things that you said is the Sultan were really against it because they simply didn't want to share wealth, like you said, mentioned. In alternate history, let's say if Sultan approve of this and Sabah Sarawak Brunei become one entity, it could be a new country or whatever form. Do you see that's happening? Could that actually becoming the truth? Is that East Malaysia, we have these three countries, and then Singapore and Malaya as one entity. Would that be ever possible?
Yeah, for North Borneo, I think we already had a relationship with the Sultan of Brunei along the coastline. In the interior, I suspect that you would have had a lot of natives asking, who is he? Who's this sultan? Because the natives in the interior, they owed loyalty to nobody but themselves. They had never been really ruled by anybody until the British sort of arrived in the interior. And even then, you still had wars going on in the interior because they just didn't like the fact that they were under somebody else's rule all of a sudden and they had to pay taxes. It's like, what is this? But I think North Borneo, it may have been possible. I think the North Borneo leaders would have seen the benefits of aligning themselves with Brunei. The Sarawakian relationship with Brunei is a little bit more different. If you look at the reports that I shared, the Sarawakians had this, and I think the Bruneians felt the same as well. Brunei had lost a large portion of its territory to Sarawak, the Brooke family, including Lawas and Nimbang and so forth. And then they had this little patch that was left on the in Borneo called Temburong. And Temburong is sort of in between Limbang and Lawas. And they were still upset that it lost that territory as well. And the Sarawakians were not interested in giving up that territory. So the relationship was strained in that regard. It's only brought up once. I've only seen it in documents brought up only once. So it may not have been a big factor. But some of the Sarawakian documents talk about how the Bruneians had been very cruel to them in the pre-Brooke years, before Brooke had arrived. And some of the taxation and piracy and so forth that was going on were actually being done by some of the Brunei Pangerans whose role was to actually collect taxes. But they had gone to business and were raiding ships, raiding villages and so forth. So there seems to be some animosity. How bad it was, nobody really knows. It's all private documents that were shared. And the Bruneians also didn't like the fact that the colonial office that ruled over Brunei was not based in Brunei, it was based in Kuching, and they didn't like that. In their mind, it was basically we're taking orders from Kuching, from Sarawak, and that shouldn't be the way. Brunei should be a kingdom on its own. We shouldn't be answerable to anybody. So, in an alternate world, Brunei may have probably merged with North Borneo and also taken back Labuan, which was originally part of Brunei anyways. And the islands around Labuan. And there are 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 islands, 6 islands that belong to Brunei as well, which North Borneo took when they took Labuan. And with Sarawak, it would have been, I think, a little bit difficult. But, Sarawak may have come around to it because Brunei, at the end of the day, was the wealthiest territory among the three. So they may have come around to it. Now, the question is this. Would the Sarawakians have been agreeable to be ruled by the Brunei Sultan again? If you look at 1961-62, a lot of Sarawakians were actually not happy and did not want to merge. They were very happy under British rule. They were very happy under the Brookes. And they were very happy with the way things had been all this time under British rule. So, it's one of those big questions that we'll never really know, right? But what I can tell you is this: the Cobalt Commission. There are arguments against the Cobalt Commission and their findings. One could today argue against the findings of the Cobalt Commission that it was flawed, and that the vast majority of people from North Borneo were actually not really sure what it was all about, this merger, or were encouraged to support it, or they merely were people that did not support it but never had their voices heard. So it's one of those things.
Yeah, I was about to ask you about the Cobalt Commission, because we usually look at history through the acts of, how you say, better men, so to say, right? And we never really take into consideration what the people at the time. And the Cobalt Commission did mention that at least 1/3 was hardcore against the merger of the federation. So we'll always have a segment of people, I think, will always carry
I
that.
actually think the more realistic figure is probably 2/3 against. That's my finding. What my belief is, looking at the documents, and this stuff hasn't been shared in public. So what I have seen, for the most part, the Chinese play a very important role in Sarawak and in North Borneo. And we tend to sort of ignore the Chinese a bit when we talk about merger. The Chinese have a very big influence on the future of North Borneo and in Sarawak as well. Most of the Chinese were against the merger, the vast majority. And if the Chinese are against the merger, the chances of somebody saying, well, it was only 1/3. I'm not saying look at the numbers, I'm saying the influence. It probably was the merger. I would say most people were actually against the merger. But the way it was set up, the Cobalt Commission was organized, and what they saw and the people they interviewed for the most part were political. And they were influenced as well. This is the right thing to do. This is the best way for all of us, and the community leaders they met had already had their heads turned that you need to say this. Now, it's a bit late now to do anything about it, but that's just the way it is. Huh? So.
Well, as a learned historian, we can only wonder, the knowledge of books that you consume over the years. So if someone who is interested in Sabah, Sarawak, particularly in this history, Brunei as well, not Borneo, for example, can you recommend some reading materials or books for us to take away?
There's a lot. You can start with Tarling. There's quite a number of books. Tarling, Treganing has done books on North Borneo. You probably can also pick up Ranjit Singh as well. He's written a book on North Borneo and Brunei as well. Professor Bilcher from UMS in Sabah, he's written a book on Brunei rule as well, which is worth reading because it's actually a book on authority, I believe, on Brunei rule over North Borneo. Essential reading. I would say you start with these guys first. There's another one, Ian Black, had written a really good book on North Borneo and Brunei rule. So, yeah, I would say probably these books are the way to go to have a basic understanding. I would say that some historians have made, when they talk about so you have to keep a very open mind because this is the European point of view, writing about North Borneo history with very limited resources. Another person that you could probably look at is Tom Harrison. Now, Tom Harrison's publishing book, he doesn't really publish books on North Borneo and Brunei. He's written a lot of short papers for the Brunei Museum and the Sarawak Museum, together with his wife, Barbara Harrison. You can read those papers as well. He covers quite a lot of ground on history for a number of different things to do with Sarawak and Brunei, which is correlated with North Borneo. Yeah, and I would say if you can work with those, that's a good start. And of course, you can find quite a fair bit of papers as well on academia.com that covers Brunei history. I would say if you're going to delve into the Sulu, which is a totally different, if you're going to delve into the Sulu question, that's a lot more complicated. So you'll find the Philippine version of Sabah history is completely different from our version of history. So yeah, just keep an open mind, I would say.
Yeah, speaking of books, because you've written some yourself, right?
Yeah.
After, could we expect anything else from you in the future? You think
Yeah,
you're publishing the future?
I'm sort of finishing. I've been working on so I've been writing a plan is to write a book with Shari Jeffrey on the false narratives of the Sulu claim over Sabah. We actually have been working on it for the last year, almost the last year. I've been working on one particular chapter for the last 9 months. It needed a bit of time because a lot of reading for that particular chapter. Because what we have found is that whilst the Sulu have claimed that they were merely looking to lease the areas that they claimed over North Borneo, I've sort of found more evidence that actually they were trying to sell anything they could find to anybody that they could find, Sandakan, Marudu, or even the whole of North Borneo to anybody that could was interested in buying. We're not even talking about leasing; it's just buying. It's actually recorded buying. So that took a bit of time to do. So we're trying to sort of add this now. This is sort of a last chapter now to complete what we've been working on. So this is a 3-4 year project, which is sort of coming to an end at some point in time this year, we hope. So publishing that, it won't be a generally big book. I think a lot of the other stuff doesn't need to be in. The early history of Brunei and the early history of the Sulu won't be in there. We're going to focus mainly on what transpired just before the Sulu were defeated in 1878, and then we're going to go into the after years. So how did it become so complicated with this claim of lease rather than sale or secession or whatever? So yeah.
Then maybe you can give us a simple answer for this, because there's a lot of people that are very worried about this Sulu claim shenanigan. Do you feel there really is a claim, or is it just a bogus statement and nonsense, really, that we really shouldn't entertain?
No, it's look. Let me put it in layman's terms. I ask you to come and help me because I'm having problems with rats in my house. You promised to come and help me to get rid of the rats in my house. You don't turn up. I end up cleaning the house of all the rats myself, and then you turn up a few days later after I've solved the problem and you say, hey, I'm here. You promised to pay me if I come and get rid of the rats. But now you don't want to pay me. So my answer would be, why must I pay you when you never turned up to help? I did all the work, so I don't need you. You can go. So what you have is you go back to the Pulau Cermin War in the sort of the mid-1600s, 13-year war, where you have an uncle and a nephew at war with each other, and both claiming to be the Sultan of Brunei at that period of time. It's a civil war. Shari Jeffrey calls it the Kimanis War, so there's 2 names for it. But ultimately, in the end, the elder Sultan, Mubin, is defeated by the younger Sultan Muhyiddin on this little island, which is directly across from Muara in Brunei today. He's defeated in a final battle on Pulau Cermin. In this particular battle, the Sulu sent a naval force of some sort, and that naval force is supposed to help the Bruneians with the final assault. Now, the Bruneians say that these guys never turned up. In the final battle, they were nowhere to be seen. So the Bruneians went on and defeated. So younger Sultan Muhyiddin defeats elder Sultan Mubin. And after the battle is over, then the Sulu force arrives at the end of the battle. And all they do is merely ransack the palace on Pulau Cermin. They take with them prisoners, which include some of the sons and wives of the Sultan Mubin, who had been killed during the battle, and they leave. And they're not heard back from again for decades, 10, 20 years. They're not heard from again. And so in the Bruneians' mind, we don't owe you anything because you actually never turned up to help like you promised to do. And so this is where the dispute starts. Bruneians say, we never promised you anything. We don't owe you anything because you didn't help us. And the Sulu side say, yeah, but you promised us something. We came, we turned up, but there's no evidence to show that they did turn up. There's no evidence to show an agreement has been signed. And agreements were signed at that period of time. There are records of agreements being signed. Now, it's kind of like me coming to your house and saying, Adi, your grandfather promised me that land over there, so I'd like to get the land title for it, and I'd like you to transfer that land to me because a long time ago he promised it to me. Now, a normal sane person would probably go, well, my grandfather never told me anything about that, and I have no interest in giving it to you because there's no instructions for me to do that. Any common person would probably say that as well. You wouldn't just give it away. And this is basically what's happened in this case as well. There's no evidence that the Sulu came and helped and won the war. They didn't. They did turn up, but they came after the battle was over. And then the person they sent back 20 years later to negotiate with the Sultan of Brunei for this claim is actually one of the sons which they kidnapped or took as prisoners from Pulau Cermin, called Dato Dracula. So they sent him back, go and see the Sultan there and get an agreement or a letter to say that we own. They refuse. The Bruneians refuse, and they tell him to go away. Eventually, he stays. He doesn't go back to Sulu. He actually stays. So they give him some titles, and he stays. And I presume that they tell him the whole story of what actually transpired. So he actually stayed. So that's the gist of it. So this Philippine narrative that that they were given all of North Borneo or a large portion of North Borneo is based on this flawed narrative that we always owned it or we were given it. The promise may have been made. Whether that promise was fulfilled is another different story as well. So that's why we have this problem, which is why the school book is very important to tell this story. So, yeah.
I think, well, that's it, the time that we have today. I know it's very odd that we end on Philippine Sulu issue. Yeah, it should be like we talk in the middle of the podcast, but hey, again, this is history and we can go on and on and on for hours here. So for the structure of the format here, it's going to be just 1 hour. So that would be the end of it. And before we leave, is there any closing remarks from you, Avtar?
No, I think the good thing is that more and more Sabahans are becoming aware that we have a history. It's a history that we should share, and that more and more people want to know about a history. But we've got to be a bit careful. What we share is based on some historical fact or some evidence, and we don't simply create stories, fantasy stories, to appease or to please people. I know that's going on. And it is not going to help us in the long term. If we do this, it will do more harm and more damage than it actually will help. So I would just probably say that, we have very good professors, very good academics in Sabah who can tell the story. We really do. And I hope they will come forward and help. Yeah.
Adi, any closing remarks from you?
Yeah, just want to say thank you again, Avtar, for being here with us today. It was very, very illuminating to a lot of things that seems to fall under the radar here. So if any of you are interested to listen to more of Avtar's works, he's published quite a few books already. Another one is coming up. And I'm sure a lot of these topics that we've gone through this past episode, definitely he's covered into greater detail on his YouTube channel. So if you are interested in checking out more of his stuff, then you can check out his YouTube channel, Avtar Singh History. And I think whether it be the Federation of Malaysia or the Sulu claim, I think Avtar definitely has that covered. So thank you so much, Avtar, for joining us today.
Most welcome. Happy to be on.
Yes.
Thanks, Haffiz.
And for our listeners, if you like this sort of topics, please comment down below. If you're listening on YouTube and also on Spotify as well, please comment that more topic like this so that we can again invite Mr. Avtar to our podcast. So keep listening on YouTube, Spotify, and also if you prefer short format, on TikTok and Instagram as well. And with that, I would like to close this podcast. Goodbye for now.